My name is Joel Meng. I'm a current junior from Cleveland, Ohio, studying journalism and American studies. I'm a proud member of Delta Tau Delta fraternity and compete on Hillsdale's forensics team. It is my honor to introduce the speaker this evening. Dr. Charles Kesler is the Dengler-Dykema Distinguished Professor of Government at Claremont McKenna College, where his students have called him compelling, interesting, and the best professor at CMC. He is a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute, editor of the Claremont Review of Books, instructor for the Claremont Institute's Publius Fellows and Lincoln Fellows programs, and host of the Claremont video series, The American Mind. Dr. Kesler is a recipient of the 2018 Bradley Prize, which honors those who have been influential in American debate and scholarly work. He is the author of I Am the Change, Barack Obama and the Crisis of Liberalism, and editor of several books, including the Federalist Papers, which some of you may have read. Dr. Kesler earned his bachelor's degree in social studies and his master's and doctorate degrees in government from Harvard University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Charles Kesler.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I'm grateful to Joel for that eloquent introduction. I had no idea he was so dangerous to be a member of the fencing team, or was it forensics? Well, one of those, whatever it was. No, Joel is stalking me because he's in my class. You know, as a Pulliam Fellow, you're supposed to teach a class, and I am. And he's one of the 10 students in that class. And then John Miller, my immediate host here at Hillsdale, had me sit in on one of his classes on Tuesday, and there was Joel in the class. Then John had me sit in on another one of his classes today. There was Joel in the class. As you can tell, John has not had a heavy teaching schedule this week. But I see Joel everywhere I go, and I'm delighted to do so. He's a very smart young man, and I will report that the 10 students in the Pulliam seminar I'm teaching are learned, witty, and there's no trouble in getting a discussion going. The only trouble is stopping the discussion at the end. But thank you, Joel, for that very generous introduction. I'm here tonight as the latest in a long series of distinguished Pulliam lecturers, and I'm grateful to the Pulliam Journalism Foundation and to Doug Jeffrey, Vice President of External Relations, and to Professor Miller, who together administer the Pulliam program here at Hillsdale. I'm especially grateful to President Larry Arnn. He and I have been friends for almost 40 years. Back then, he's right here, Larry Arnn. Have you ever met him? He's a very nice fellow. Back then, we would never have believed we could be so old. But now, looking back, it's hard to believe we were ever so young. But through it all, I have treasured my friendship with Larry and his beautiful wife, Penny, who's also here tonight. I've had to listen to a lot of Churchill stories. But really, are there any better stories, you know? So I feel enlightened. American politics today are not nearly so inspiring as those scenes from Churchill's life. Obnoxious gangs accost the president's press secretary and a U.S. senator trying to have dinner with their families in Washington, D.C., forcing them to flee. On campuses across the country, not Hillsdale, conservative speakers are shouted down, or otherwise prevented from speaking. A former director of the CIA denounces the current president as a traitor. The Democratic presidential nominee condemns most of her opponent's supporters as deplorable and indeed irredeemable racists, sexists, and bigots. Judge Kavanaugh's nomination to the Supreme Court is assailed at the last minute by a series of accusers whose accusations, each more outrageous than the last, paint him as not only a deplorable sexist, but as an irredeemable sexual criminal. These incidents and many others like them warn us not only of a breakdown in civility, but of a dangerous rupture in our civil fabric. Now, I imagine that many of you have been waiting as eagerly as I have for the publication of the paperback edition of Hillary Clinton's recent book, titled, as you know, What Happened? I think there are a couple of other words in the middle between what and happened that her editor must have snipped. But your wait is over. The paperback is out and includes a new afterword in which she evaluates the Trump presidency so far. Alongside her plea for a return to civility, she writes that President Trump rejects the rule of law and comes close to being, quote, a tyrant, plain and simple, unquote. He wages war on truth and reason, denigrates the free press, and undermines national unity and civil rights through his racist hate speech, that's her term, hate speech, and divisive policies. Thank you for your civility, Madam Secretary. But American politics has always been rough and ready. What's revealing is that she doesn't blame Trump for these transgressions. Quote, he is as much a symptom as a cause, she writes, of these authoritarian tendencies. The true blame lies with, quote, the increasing radicalism and irresponsibility of the Republican Party, including decades of demeaning government, demonizing Democrats, and debasing norms. In other words, it's the GOP that gave us Donald Trump. And the GOP is the party guilty, she says, of stealing a Supreme Court seat. I hope we get back that Supreme Court seat. And also working, she says, to disenfranchise African Americans and denying climate change. She blames also a small group of right-wing billionaires who have helped to build, she, quote, an alternative reality where science is denied, lies masquerade as truth, and paranoia flourishes. I don't mean to quote so much that you'll be discouraged from running out to buy the book, but here is one gripping sentence, quote, by undermining the common factual framework that allows a free people to deliberate together and make the important decisions of self-government, the Republicans opened the way for the infection of Russian propaganda and Trumpian lies to take hold, unquote. In the eyes of our liberal Democratic accusers, we are all Trumpians now. We conservatives, I mean, and have been for decades. So Trump is not, anything special. He's just a Republican. And believe me, if Jeb Bush had won or Marco Rubio had won, the arguments would be virtually the same. Any Republican. Think back to George W. Bush, H.W. Bush, Reagan. The arguments against them had the same tendency. I will say that Hillary is right about one thing. Deliberation is the activity of rationally choosing means to agreed upon ends. If we don't agree more or less on our ends, there's little possibility of debating civilly about the means to those ends. what the Federalist Papers called the, quote, the cool, deliberate sense of the community, unquote, cannot emerge if there is no community sharing fundamental ends and rationally deliberating on them. 6 years ago, I wrote a book about Barack Obama in which I predicted that modern liberalism, under pressures both fiscal and philosophical, would either go out of business or be forced to radicalize. If it chose the latter, I predicted it could radicalize along one or both of two lines, towards socialism and or towards an increasingly postmodern, that is, willful and nihilistic form of leadership and representation. Actually, American liberalism is trying both. Bernie Sanders' view of the world, as you know, is ascendant. The latest thing with the youngest generation of Democratic leaders is to embrace socialism openly, something that would have been impossible and unheard of during the Cold War. But so in the ascendant is also identity politics, with its quasi-Nietzschean faith in race, sex, and power as the keys to being and meaning. In the Me Too movement, for example, we've heard a lot of this in connection with Judge Kavanaugh's nomination. The credo is always believe the woman, because she is a woman. In other words, truth will emerge not from an adversarial process weighing evidence and testimony before the bar of reason, but from yielding to the will of the more politically correct. Her truth is stronger than any objective or disinterested truth. But how can we have a common factual framework, in Hillary's terms, if the facts depend on values and all values are relative, and hence the strongest values dictate the facts and thus the truth? In the Claremont Review of Books, the journal I edit, we have described our current political scene as a cold civil war. A cold civil war is better than a hot or shooting one, but it is not a good situation for a country to be in. Underlying our cold civil war, I think, is the fact that America is torn increasingly between two rival constitutions, two cultures, two ways of life. Political scientists sometimes distinguish between normal politics and regime politics. Normal politics take place within a political and constitutional order and concern means, not ends. By contrast, regime politics is about who rules and for what ends or principles. It questions the nature of the political system itself. Who has rights? Who gets to vote? And what do we honor or revere together as a people? I fear America may be leaving the world of normal politics and entering the dangerous world of regime politics, in which our political loyalties diverge more and more, as they did in the 1850s, between two contrary visions of the country. One of these is based on what we may call the original Constitution as amended. This is the Constitution grounded in natural rights, the Constitution that was written and ratified in 1787 and has been transmitted to us with significant changes, some improvements and some not, but recognizable still as the original Constitution. To simplify matters, we may call this the conservatives' Constitution, though conservatives have never agreed perfectly on its meaning, and many non-conservatives, of course, remain loyal to it. The other Constitution is what first progressives and then liberals for 100 years now have called candidly the living Constitution. This term, the living Constitution, implies that the original one is dead, or at least on life support, and that in order to remain relevant to our national life, the written Constitution must be infused with new meaning and new ends, and therefore with new duties, rights, and powers, new administrative agencies, new mandates, all overleaping any structural limitations that the original Constitution may have tried to put on government. As a doctrine, the living Constitution originated not in law schools, but in America's new departments of political science and social science in the late 19th century. And it was soon at the very forefront of progressive politics. It's always been more than just a doctrine for judges. It was intended to offer a way towards hope and change for all three branches of government and eventually for American society as a whole. One of its prime formulators, Woodrow Wilson, as a young man, had contemplated actually a series of constitutional amendments to reform American national government into a kind of parliamentary system which would be able to bring faster change to American politics. But he quickly realized that that plan, amending the Constitution, was going nowhere. Plan B, however, was the living Constitution. While keeping the outward forms of the old, it would change utterly the spirit in which the Constitution was understood. The resulting Constitution, the liberals' Constitution, is not a constitution of natural right, of individual human rights, but of historical or evolutionary right. Wilson called the spirit of the old arrangements Newtonian, after Isaac Newton, and of the new ones he was proffering Darwinian, after Charles Darwin. Certainly one of the few times an American president invoked Charles Darwin as an authority and as a source of political reform. By Darwinian, Wilson meant a constitution that, far from being unchanging or as difficult to amend as possible, would be mutable, amenable easily to experimentation, and adjustable to the zeitgeist. The late Walter Burns had a neat formula for this change. He said the point of the old Constitution was to keep the times in tune with the Constitution. The purpose of the new is to keep the Constitution in tune with the times. But until the 1960s or so, most progressives and American liberals expected the living Constitution, theirs, to replace the original Constitution, the conservatives, gradually, almost imperceptibly. They expected progress, not revolution. They charted a kind of conservative, slow motion path to liberalism. They were evolutionists, Darwinians, remember. Then something unexpected happened, something unexpected by the liberals at least. What happened was the 60s, in which the so-called New Left abandoned evolution for revolution. And partly in response, the defenders of the old Constitution began not merely to fight back, to try to slow evolution down, but actually to call for a return to the first principles of the Constitution. By seeking to revolve back to the starting point, they proved to be Newtonians after all, and also in a way revolutionaries, since the original meaning of revolution is to return to where you began, as a celestial body revolves in the heavens. Called by many names and many connections, the conservatives who in the 1950s and especially the 60s and 70s, who began an epic campaign against the inevitable emergence of the living Constitution, had in common the desire and the felt duty to oppose the gradual or the sudden disappearance of limited government and of Republican virtue in our political life. When it became clear by the 1970s and 80s that the conservative surrender, slow motion surrender, was off, the cold Civil War was on. Confronted by sharper, deeper, and more compelling accounts of the conservatives' Constitution, the liberals had to sharpen, that is, radicalize their own alternative, following the paths paved by the new left. So rather than converging, the living Constitution and the old conservative one diverged, and the gap between them became a gulf. So today, we are two countries, or we're on the road to becoming two countries, each constituted differently. Consider a few of the contrasts. The prevailing liberal doctrine of rights traces individual rights to membership in various groups, racial, ethnic, gender, now class-based groups, which are undergoing a continual process of consciousness raising and empowerment. This was already a prominent feature of progressivism 100 years ago, though the groups have changed since then. When Woodrow Wilson wrote his textbook, when he was a political scientist before he ran for office, he wrote a textbook. The first question in the textbook is, which races shall we study? I'm not making this up. I mean, can you imagine? You open the textbook, the first question, which races shall we study? And his answer was, it's simple, it's straightforward, we'll study the Aryan race. Because the Aryan race is the one that has mastered the world. The countries of Europe, the Anglophone countries, America, Australia, Canada, and so forth, have conquered the world. And, Africa, Asia, most of these were colonized by European powers. They had the white European civilization, the Aryans, had science, the arts, armaments, all the advantages, wealth on their side. So from Wilson's point of view, you studied the winning race, the Aryans, not the losing races. Now, he was not a racist in the full sense of the term, because he expected the less advanced races over time to catch up with the Aryan race, over a great deal of time to catch up with the Aryan race. His version of politics is really our version, except the winning and the losing sides have been switched. And now, white supremacy, white power is the devil. And in a way, the white race, European civilization, dead white males, you're familiar with all these wonderful diminishments. They're the enemy, and all the races that were oppressed in the past are now in the driver's seat. They are the races that need today compensation, privileges, and power to make up for their neglect in the past. But the analysis is the same. It's just that who is on the top, on the receiving end, and who's on the bottom have changed. The centrality of groups and the derivation of your status as an individual from your membership in a group hasn't changed at all. Today's campuses, there is what they call identity politics and the identitarian obsession, which you can see in affirmative action policy and in other large stretches of American law and mores. And basically the liberal argument is the same, but the winning and losing groups in that argument have shifted. Now, conservatives too treasure minority rights, but conservatives regard the individual as the quintessential and most endangered minority. They trace individual rights, we trace, if I may say, individual rights to human nature, which lacks a race. A human being has no race, per se. A human being can be yellow, red, black, white, be almost any color. Human nature lacks a race other than the human race, and also lacks all ethnicity, gender, or class. And it's to the essence of an individual as a human being that conservatives trace their rights. We have rights because we're human beings, not because we're tall or short human beings, or white or yellow human beings, but because we are human beings with a soul, with reason, and distinct from other animals and from God. We're not beasts, but we're not God. We're that in-between being. And conservatives seek to vindicate this human equality and liberty, including majority rule, against the liberal constitution's semi-feudal alternative, where everything is based on your group, your race, your gender, your class, and so forth. That's how far liberals and conservatives are apart from one another now. How far the two constitutions have diverged. There's a liberal First Amendment today and a conservative First Amendment. Nowadays, liberals are very interested in turning free speech into what they call equal speech, ensuring that no one gets more than his fair share of it. The new emphasis leads to trying to redistribute speech rights via limits on campaign contributions, repealing Citizens United, and even amending the First Amendment to narrow it in order to take speech rights from those who have too many, the rich, and give them to those who have too few, the poor. And I remind you, the official position of the Democratic Party in its platform in 2016 was to amend the First Amendment, to narrow the First Amendment. As you know, there's a big difference also between the original Constitution's freedom of religion and the competing liberal Constitution's freedom from religion. Another glaring difference is that the liberals' Constitution has no Second Amendment. The living Constitution, theirs, is designed to overcome, you've heard this today if you were at the earlier excellent panel preceding tonight's dinner, but the living Constitution is designed to overcome separation of powers and all other restrictions, checks and balances on the government. What they lust for is the ability to coordinate, concentrate, and enhance government power, not to separate it, restrict it, check it. Because this power has flowed mainly through the hands of unelected administrators and judges, our elected Congress finds itself increasingly dispirited and unable to legislate. As the Financial Times put it recently, our Congress is a sausage factory that has forgotten how to make sausage. How is it possible to resolve our cold Civil War without turning it into something much worse? Well, I think there are probably 5 paths forward. One would be to change the political subject. You know, Ronald Reagan used to say that when the little green men arrive, from outer space, all of our political differences will be transcended, and humanity will unite for the first time in human history. Well, I'm here to tell you, if that happens, the cold Civil War is off. If some other jarring event, a big war, or a huge natural calamity happened that might also reset our politics too. The subject would be changed. But if we can't change the subject, then a second possibility would be perhaps we could change our minds. That is, maybe persuasion, or some combination of persuasion and moderation would allow us to end or to endure a continuing division of the sort we have. Perhaps one party or side will persuade a majority of the electorate to embrace its constitution, and thus one side will win at the polling booth or in the legislature. Now, for generations, Republicans have longed for a realigning election that would turn the GOP into America's majority party and political faith. Though certainly possible, it looks, I think, unlikely. Only 2 presidents in the 20th century were able to effect enduring changes in American public opinion and voting patterns: Franklin Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan. FDR inspired a political realignment that lasted for a generation or so, and that lifted the Democratic Party to majority status. Ronald Reagan inspired a realignment of public policy, but wasn't able to make the GOP into the majority party. Since 1968, the norm has been divided government, in which the people have more often preferred to split control of the national government between the Democrats and the Republicans, rather than to entrust it entirely into the hands of one or the other party. This was never the pattern in American history until the post-1968 period. Until 1968, most of the time, not all of the time, but most of the time, Americans would entrust the Senate, the House, and the presidency to the same party in each election. They would change the party sometimes, but still they would vote for a party to run the government. That has not been the pattern for a long time now. So 1968 is a long time ago. Neither President Obama nor President Trump so far has persuaded the American electorate to embrace his party as their natural representative, worthy of patriotic allegiance over a generation or more. Now, Trump, of course, is new to this, and his party in Congress particularly is basically pre-Trumpian. He has not had a chance to change the composition of the House and the Senate very much. He did not win the 2016 election, despite what he might say, by a very large margin, and he was not able to bring in large numbers of new Republicans into the House or the Senate. It's the Republican Party that you see there is basically a pre-Trumpian party. Nonetheless, he has the opportunity now to teach Republicans how and why to fight like he does. That is, not to flinch in the face of political correctness and elite opinion. From what I hear of the Kavanaugh hearings today, a few Republican senators, Lindsey Graham apparently, at last may be catching on. But the narrowness of Trump's populism, which is not a word he uses, by the way, to describe himself or his movement, means that he still needs some parts of the pre-existing conservative coalition or the conservative electoral base and some parts of the conservative arguments. His populism is not enough. He has to reach out to the existing Republican Party, as he has done, adopt some of its agenda, adopt its electoral supporters, but of course gradually change them, bring them around to America First conservatism, if he's to have any chance of bringing off a future political realignment. And I would have to say, as a political scientist, that the odds remain against him at this point. If we can't change our minds by winning over the liberals, there is still the possibility maybe that we could moderate our disagreements and learn to live with them more or less permanently. But to me, that too seems unlikely, given the embittered trajectory of the last 2 decades. So, if we won't change our minds and can't change the subject, I think there are only 3 other ways out of the cold Civil War. One might be a vastly reinvigorated federalism. One of the reasons for constitutional federalism in the first place was that the states had a variety of interests and views that clashed with one another and could not be pursued in common. If we had a reflowering of federalism, some of the differences between blue states and red states could be handled discreetly by the states themselves. The disruptive issues could be denationalized. But again, the problem is we have abandoned so much of traditional federalism. It's hard to see how it could come to our rescue at this late juncture. Economic and technological changes, I think, appear at least to militate against this solution too. So, my friends, that leaves 2 remaining possibilities. One, alas, is secession, which is a danger to any federal system. James Madison wrote about this at great length in The Federalist. Anytime you've got a federal system, you face a possibility that some states will try to leave it. And I remember from my youth the wonderful libertarian bumper sticker. You know, libertarians are sort of pro-secession in a certain way, some of them. The bumper sticker said, "If at first you don't secede, try again." But it is a possibility. The Czech Republic and Slovakia have gone their separate ways, peacefully, just within the last generation. But America is much better at expansion than contraction. And George Washington's admonitions to preserve the Union, I think, still maybe miraculously somehow linger in our ears. So secession would be extremely difficult for many reasons. Not the least of which is that it could lead, as we know from experience, to the 5th and worst possibility, civil war, and not of the cold kind. Under present circumstances, the American constitutional future seems to be approaching some kind of crisis, a crisis of the 2 constitutions. The timing and exact dimensions of which remain obscure. Let us pray that our countrymen will find a way to reason together, to compromise our differences, which will allow us to avoid the worst of these dire scenarios. So, ladies and gentlemen, I leave you with this thought: here's to the better angels of our nature. Thank you very much.
Brought to you.
If this is 1859, is 1861 inevitable?
Did you hear that question? Okay. The question was, if this is 1859, is 1861 inevitable? Well, in the first place, I don't think it's 1859. It's earlier than that. No, it's not inevitable. I mean, I don't think anything in politics is really inevitable in that sense, in the sense of preordained. If you believe that human beings are free, that is, have free will and a reason to guide free will, you can't believe in any inevitability in history because you just don't know what they will do. And that's my position. We don't know. My analysis only goes this far, that the trends are bad, and that it used to be that Republicans, Democrats, the old Constitution, the new Constitution, agreed on enough to have a kind of common civic culture still. We agree on elections, we agreed on civil rights, we agreed on sort of the dignity of American history and the heroes of American history, more or less. But I am disturbed by the fact that that common ground is eroding. I don't think it's inevitable that it will continue to erode, much less to the point of civil war. But I think that that is the direction of current events. I mean, how many, how much ink has been spilled by the left in arguing that President Trump is not a legitimate president because he was not elected by the popular majority? How much was spilled against George W. Bush after the 2000 election in the same vein? Elections are less a unifying event than they used to be. And secondly, civil rights. The definition of civil rights is beginning to slip away. A common definition of civil rights, as I argued, is beginning to slip away. And third, the common civic culture, the common heroes, the common history is now radically under assault by a left that has only in the last generation turned against America. I mean, FDR, even LBJ, certainly Woodrow Wilson, John F. Kennedy, they were optimists about America. They believed in America. However, liberal their interpretation of America, for them, Lincoln was a hero, Washington was a hero, and the Union was a moral cause for them. But increasingly, starting in the universities, the left has made the argument that it's not, in fact, just the plutocrats, the few, that they opposed in the American past and the American present, it's the many. And so the argument is not now that Americans, have been bamboozled by the rich and dominated by the capitalists, although that argument is still heard. But the basic argument is America is a sick country. It's been racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, transphobic, etc., from the very beginning. And not just the minority, the majority, the people have been corrupt, morally sick from the very beginning. It's very hard to find common ground with that opinion. Now, it is true that even Hillary Clinton and many other liberals are now calling for a renewal of civic education in America. But the problem, this is part of their reaction against Trump. They believe, Trump is betraying America, so they want to sort of go back to America. And Obama was very much on the same wavelength. But the problem is their America and our America are really moving in opposite directions. So what would be the core of civic education? That's the problem.
Sir, thank you very much I'm over here.
Over here, sorry.
Thank you very much for your speech tonight. I don't know exactly where to begin because I go back to a fundamental part that we seem to have lost in our education and our common knowledge about our founding. There is a common key between the Declaration and the Constitution that we have lost. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, which has no color, has no national boundary, and has no country, except in the concept of what it is. And that's the foundation from which our Constitution was begun. And unless we get that back, I don't understand how we come to a common knowledge of who and what we are. Your comment, sir.
Well, did everyone hear that? I couldn't agree with you more. Larry Arnn has written a very good book about the relationship between the Declaration and the Constitution, which I recommend to everyone, if he's not already stuffed a copy in your knapsack. You should read it. I agree with that, and President Obama might agree with that too in his own way. Anymore, President Obama, despite his radical side, is looking like a moderate in the Democratic context, the context of the Democratic Party. He's criticized Hillary for having, said that half of Trump's supporters are deplorable and irredeemable racists and sexists and so forth. Now, I'm sure he believes the same thing. His remarks about clingers, to their guns and God and so forth, point in the same direction. But at least he recognized that when he made that remark, that was a mistake, and he never made it again. Hillary is doubling down on that. So, from President Obama's point of view, the founding is defensible because the founding enshrined only one real self-evident truth, and that was that America is open to change. And that's his whole, that's what he honors in the founding, that the founding allowed us the ability to surpass it and supplant it and to leave it behind and to make a better America in which racism has been at least partially overcome because we could elect a black president. He doesn't want to write himself out of history, after all, so he has to be proud of that, and even of the country that did that elected him. But the idealism of that is expressed in your statement, that the ideals of the Declaration inform the Constitution, and even the compromises with slavery in the Constitution have to be seen in the light of an anti-slavery principle. There are some people on the left, fortunately, who still believe that, but I think they are in the minority and in a diminishing minority.
Thank you, first off, for coming out to Hillsdale College. My question is twofold, touching on what you were just discussing. First, is this discussion going on in the left, in the Commonwealth clubs, or it's not a monolithic movement? What are they looking at with regard to the prospects of a hot or cold civil war? And secondly, to younger generations who are watching this sort of political combat and being baptized in it, is there any indication there that in the longer run, should America move beyond this particular moment of crisis, that there can become a new consensus? Thank you.
Well, those are very good questions. So they were audible? Okay. If you talk to young people on campus, as I do, if you teach young people, you see, a new cohort every year, always younger. I've been surprised in just the last 2 or 3 years how quickly what was a radical view of America, a marginalized sort of view of America, has become commonplace in them. And they didn't learn it in college. They picked it up in high school. But now students, to my surprise, talk about white supremacy as though it were everyone, it was a fact of life that everyone always knew about and had acknowledged. In fact, the term was rare and certainly not the prevailing lens through which to look at America and American history. But even conservative students, in my experience in Claremont, have learned that rhetoric. They want to move beyond it, they want to, pierce it, but they haven't yet learned how. And so the whole identitarian, to use a horrible word, agenda that sort of comes with the notion of white supremacy, the charge of white supremacy, is very current among the freshmen, sophomores, juniors, seniors that I teach. Now, this ought to, in a way, this is a cause for pessimism, but it's also in a way a cause for optimism, because it shows you that if you get to them young, you can influence their thought, you can shape their thought. And if they only heard some arguments on the other side, they would be able to think their way through this prejudice. But the fact is, they apparently haven't heard many arguments on the other side. So they're not, I mean, the young, Nietzsche says the young are always too angry and too reverent. And that's true, I think. But they want to learn. And so we need to find a way to teach them. We need to find a way to get to them. It's very difficult, though, when the faculties themselves are so biased ideologically, politically, as you all know. One of the great things about Hillsdale is obviously that it's bucking that trend, and in a big and noble way. But it is it's very difficult. Now, but the left as a whole, I think, is still torn on this question. And depending on how things work out in the midterm elections and how things work out in 2020, the great thing about the American political system is that there are elections, and it does reward and punish certain politicians and certain positions. There was, if you remember back in the 1970s, 1980s, the Democratic Leadership Council, which was a movement of centrist Democrats to take the party back from McGovern and the sort of extreme anti-Vietnam left that had seized power in the early 1970s with the nomination of McGovern in 1972. After McGovern, you got Jimmy Carter, who was a much more centrist figure, and you got eventually Bill Clinton in the 1990s, who had been president of the Democratic Leadership Council. Something like that is still possible, but the problem is we've moved farther left than we were in 1972, and so the movement would have to be well-funded and have a lot of grassroots as well as the gumption to fight. And right now, I don't see any sure signs of that. But it's possible. And losing big enough would be the incentive to make it probable. Yes, sir, I guess. Oh, sorry, you're... Oh, sorry. You've got a competitor right behind you.
Younger than you too, so. Thank you, Dr. Arnn, for another exceptional speaker, and hello, Miss Penny. Could you describe a course of action to counter what we're encountering now?
Yes, well, I think the best thing happening in American politics right now is Donald Trump, I think. He's not an he has some limitations, but I think fundamentally he is on the side of the country. He is against the multicultural, or you might say the nihilistic left, and its hatred of America. I think what making America great again really means is it's a challenge. It's a challenge to fight for the center of American politics. Do we actually believe that America was once great? And the left basically doesn't. And so do we want to make America great again presumes that we were once great and that we know why we were great, and that by perhaps following those or similar policies, we could be great again. And so he's appealing in a way to not just Republicans or even self-proclaimed conservatives, but to a vast middle of the country who still love America and still want America to succeed. And he had the insight, though not at all a politician or a practiced or groomed politician, to make that appeal, to make it bluntly, to make it powerfully, and I think persuasively to a lot of Americans. Now, again, he won, by a very narrow constitutional majority, and apparently not by a popular majority, but he won, and that's a very important datum. And as usual in such cases, you can learn a lot by studying the winning strategy. And I think that Trump is getting better. His rhetoric is getting better. His speeches are getting better. He still has a way to go, but he began as a complete amateur. I mean, you can't really overestimate how much of an amateur he was. I mean, he never stood for election for any office anywhere. And so that's unusual in American history. I mean, the presidency is not usually an entry-level position. But things were so desperate that a complete outsider was in a position to do the common sense thing, to make the common sense appeal, which none of the other candidates, much more sophisticated, much more politically experienced, sort of saw needed to be done and how to do it. So I think we owe the president our support and also our counsel in his efforts to make America great again, which really means to make Americans believe in America again.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you.
He
Given
was passed over.
Given the options, I think I'll be praying for little green men to arrive soon. I think. One hears more and more today, indeed even on James Dobson recently, about the idea of an Article 5 Convention of States, which wasn't among your options. And I just wondered if you would comment on what you think might be the practicality, but also the prudence of that option.
Well, it wasn't among my options because I don't think it's a practical way forward. The problem with an Article 5 convention is you have to have, which is a way of, the states bypassing the Congress in calling a convention to propose amendments to the Constitution. Those amendments then have to go back to the states for 3/4 ratification as in the conventional process. But the problem is who will be the James Madison and the Alexander Hamilton and the James Wilson at the convention? And besides that, I mean, a way of saying the same thing differently is you don't want to hold a convention unless you know what amendments you want to come out of it. I mean, you have to know what the ends are before you work for the means to those ends. And I looking at the right today, there's great confusion about what's really necessary. And there's a lot of attention on things like the balanced budget amendment and so forth, which I think would be only very marginally, if at all, helpful in this. The real problem is in the people. It's in the electorate. And we have to rally that. We have to make the argument why the Constitution is good before we can move to the argument about how to make it better. And I don't think that right now a convention to make the Constitution better would really succeed because the major premise has not been established in the hearts and minds of the people solidly enough. So I'm not for that because it seems to me imprudent and unavailing right now.
Thank you.